Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here, and today I'm going to be talking about writing a philosophy paper, Part 2, Sources. If you haven't seen the other video on Part 1, was on the distinction between philosophizing and scholarship. So today we're talking about writing a philosophy paper, Sources. Well, what exactly is meant by sources? Well, if you watched the previous video that distinguishes between philosophizing and scholarship, that distinction involved a discussion, or at least some discussion, of sources. And scholarship is all about sources. In order to do scholarship, you have to know what the sources are, where to find them, and just as important, which kinds of objects, which kinds of documents are not going to be acceptable as sources. So the first point of clarification is I'm going to be talking about sources that are considered academic sources. All right, so philosophizing will involve primary sources, and scholarship will involve secondary sources. So we're all talking about academic sources, and academic sources will divide into primary and secondary, and there's a few others as well, and I'll talk about them as I go along. Now, I should have a bit of a disclaimer here. That is, not every professor in every discipline, or even within my discipline of philosophy, will agree exactly with everything I'm going to say here. There will be rough agreement on primary sources, secondary sources, which ones are pretty well acceptable, which ones are clearly not, but there will be some borderline issues. And I'll give you a warning when I might be saying something that's somewhat idiosyncratic or maybe not absolutely generally accepted. So you have to be careful when you're writing your philosophy paper with your sources. There are some that are pretty well rock solid and safe. There's some that might be a little bit more questionable. So what I always say to my students, if you're in doubt, come and talk to me. So the same goes to you in other courses. If you're in doubt, go talk to your professor, ask her, ask him what they think, and try and get an answer so that you're not in doubt about handing something in. All right, so there's a number of things to deal with here. Primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources, gray literature, and non-academic sources. So all kinds of sources. It's a good thing to get a bit of a handle on each of them. Again, I'm giving you some rough guidelines. Always ask when you're in doubt. Well, 1 to 3, I'm talking about really as academic sources. What do we mean by a primary source, a secondary, and a tertiary? The gray literature can be sometimes borderline, and I'm going to give a few pointers over what I think are non-academic sources. And again, some professors might disagree. Always ask. Some professors might say, no, I'm being too restrictive. That's fine. Always consult the instructor of the course. Let's talk a little bit about primary sources. These are mainly the works. These are the historical works. These are the ones that most people think of when you say you're studying philosophy. Well, what are you studying? Well, I'm going to be reading some philosophy books. So something like Plato's Republic. That's a good example, a straightforward example of a primary source in philosophy. Aristotle, Metaphysics. No problems with that. Nobody's going to doubt that that's a primary source. St. Augustine, Confessions, Descartes, Meditations. Again, these are the canonical works, the standard works in a history of philosophy course or a specialized course on an author. You'll read things like this, the great Immanuel Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. Can't get much more of a weightier tome than that, and is clearly a primary source. So once we've done this bit with primary sources, they're not too terribly difficult to think about. The waters are a little bit muddier when it comes to secondary sources, but they're not too muddy. There are some guidelines that you can use to keep yourself quite safe. Secondary sources are traditionally those documents that are about the primary sources. So primary sources are usually when authors like Kant, Hume, Descartes, Plato, are trying to put forward philosophical theories and discussions, and the secondary sources is criticism. Critics reflecting on the primary sources. So, while something like Plato's Republic is a primary source, secondary sources deal with the issues that are raised and discussed in primary sources. But Again, you need to be careful here because there's tons and tons of secondary sources. And of course, this day of the internet, it's so easy to find secondary sources. They're all over the place. For instance, go to the web, Google something like Plato's Theaetetus. I did that, in fact, not too long ago, and I pulled up about 97,000 entries. Now, many of these entries under the Google's list are translations, so they would be examples of translations of the primary source, the original Theaetetus, and that's fine. Some translations are better than others, so you'll have discrepancies even there, but the translations would be primary sources, but of course there would be lots and lots of secondary sources. And it's very important that not all the secondary sources are going to be academic secondary sources. So just because you found something that is, let's say, written by someone about the Theaetetus or about something to do with Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, you can't rest assured that that's an academic secondary source. So your professors are interested in helping you to use the proper, that is, academic secondary sources. Now, that raises a question. Well, if I'm going to pull up all these sources and I can recognize some of them are secondary because they're about primary sources, how do I start distinguishing between these secondary sources that are just not really usable or non-academic and those secondary sources that are acceptable in an academic setting? And remember, we're talking about what's acceptable in an academic setting. That doesn't mean acceptable in all ways, because lots of documents may not be acceptable in an academic setting. That doesn't mean they're useless completely, but they're not necessarily the documents that you would use in your philosophy courses. Keep in mind that the world doesn't begin and end just with academic sources. Now, let's ask ourselves, well, I've got some secondary sources here. Some general rules you can, some general kinds of questions. Is it published by a university-based publisher, like a Cambridge or an Oxford, University of Toronto Press, University of Ottawa Press, St. Paul's, etc., etc. Check that out. If it's published by a university-based publisher, chances are it's an academic source. Is it written by an expert in the area, someone, let's say, with a PhD? Is it written by a professor or a doctor? Chances are you're on track to an academic source, secondary source. So again, if in doubt, if you're not sure about these things, talk to your professor. But there's another way to be fairly easy and efficient in your search for these secondary sources, and that is to avoid using Google. Careful with Google. I'll talk a little bit about Google later. And Google's great, but careful as thinking of it as your academic search engine. What I would suggest, to be a little bit more on the safe side, is go to the databases that collect academic sources, like JSTOR, like Philosopher's Index. In this sense, you're going to be looking up Plato's Theaetetus, going through JSTOR, and the articles that you're going to get will be pretty well academic articles. So you're going to be pretty safe in the first place. So put yourself in the situation of using databases that deal with academic sources. The same thing for the Philosopher's Index. And these, although you have to subscribe to them, no doubt your university does, and you can go through the library system and gain access to these, and you're pretty safe as far as the articles that you're going to pull up there. Tertiary sources. What are those? Well, those tend to be a little bit more difficult to figure out. Tertiary sources, and here I give you the curmudgeon warning. I'm pretty strict about them. Right? I tend to say I don't want to see those in essays. Those are background sources. And they can be good background, that is academic background sources, and maybe not so good of background sources. An excellent background tertiary source is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I want to be very clear what I mean here about using this as a tertiary source. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is an academic source in the sense that it is an encyclopedia that is vetted. In other words, professional philosophers write the entries and they're looked over and examined, so you can be very confident of the various encyclopedic entries that you get in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now, here's the bit more of the curmudgeon in me, and again, a warning, not all professors will agree with this. But I always tell my students that these are excellent articles to read as background. If you're not familiar with the Theaetetus, go and read the article on the Theaetetus. If you're not familiar with Aristotle's Metaphysics, go and read the article. But that article itself, while they're excellent, I have no problems with them, they're great articles in it, you're not really using those articles to cite and to quote from in your essay. Those are background articles. But these articles that are in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you go to the end of the articles, you'll find excellent bibliographies. And those bibliographies contain the secondary and the primary sources that you will use in your essay. So think of this as an excellent, that is, think of the Stanford Encyclopedia as an excellent springboard, rounding out your knowledge, giving you what kind of debates are going on, and then you can use the bibliographies to find the primary and the secondary sources. And that's my point of view. Again, check with your professor. Not everybody's going to agree with this. Now, while the Stanford Encyclopedia is a tertiary and excellent resource, let's look a little bit at what's called gray literature. This is not something that traditionally we've used a lot in philosophy, although some professors may differ. But a rough definition of gray literature, which is a term coined roughly in the 70s, is a term that refers to documents like annual reports, working papers, technical reports, and so on. It can be very difficult to evaluate whether or not this kind of literature is acceptable in an academic setting. So be careful with this. Again, always ask your professor. You might ask a couple of professors, and get their advice on this. But even though it's not necessary, even though that gray literature can be difficult to evaluate, it's often very necessary in certain fields. As I said, at one time, philosophy professors wouldn't really have worried about this, but here at St. Paul's, for instance, we have programs in the School of Public Ethics, which is housed in the Faculty of Human Sciences and Philosophy. We have programs on public ethics that deal with a lot of issues in large-scale examinations of ethical behavior by organizations, by governments, and so on. Well, in order to understand a lot of those behaviors, you have to look at some of the gray literature that is produced by these governments and organized bodies of various types. So, in that case, you're going to have to read technical reports, annual reports, and they will become the objects that you research and analyze and write on. So again, you might need empirical data. Well, you're not going to get that in the academic philosophical journals. They're written in a different style. You might need empirical data that's produced and is commonly referred to as gray literature. But again, you have to be careful with this, so always talk to your professor if in doubt. All right. A little bit on non-academic sources. Once again, there's disagreement here, and again, the curmudgeon alert. I'm pretty restrictive on this stuff. And again, I don't mean anything pejorative by a non-academic source. There's lots of things that are non-academic sources that I use, but I don't use them in my research and in my writing and in my teaching. So, what are non-academic sources? Well, there's a variety of things, like newspapers and magazines. I read newspapers and magazines all the time, but I don't really use them in my teaching. I may refer to them, for example, in a course, let's say on a current affairs or whatnot, but they're not really things that we study. However, you may find from time to time that they are relevant. Again, talk to your professor about it. But you can get a lot out of newspapers and magazines, but always be careful about embedding them in your philosophical work or your technical work for a course. This might be a good place just to remind, though, that there is a difference between writing scholarly articles about the media and doing things in the media. They're not the same thing. If you're not clear on this kind of a distinction, it's related to what I talked about in the distinction between scholarship and philosophizing. All right, so a couple other sources or search engines that you should be a little bit wary of and careful about. And again, curmudgeon alert, this is my view. Maybe not every professor will agree with this. I talked a little bit about Google earlier, be careful with Google. It's too easy to think that Google will give you all the answers, and it's also too easy to think that if you can't find it on Google, it doesn't exist. Google is a powerful search engine, but Google is not omniscient. There's lots of stuff that you won't find that's up on the web. You won't find it through Google. So don't just assume that, oh, I tried this and I Googled it and it wasn't there, so well, I'm stuck. It's not there at all. I've had many students come in my office claiming that they couldn't find something, and that's exactly what they did. They looked on Google and couldn't find it. You have to be a little bit more inventive. So don't be fooled by thinking that Google can find you absolutely everything. And a word of caution, a big word of caution, again, these are my views about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a crowdsourced online document. It's free. There's all kinds of great stuff on Wikipedia. But it's not an academic source. That is, some of its information is really good. You could even cite statistics that show that, statistically speaking, a lot of the information on Wikipedia is accurate. However, there are lots of problems with it too when you get into the real specifics. Wikipedia, because it is crowdsourced and people get in and get involved with it, sure, people correct each other's mistakes, but it also reflects a lot of public opinion on what's important, and the sites that or the articles that are sufficiently developed or developed in detail tend to reflect interests of the day, not necessarily scholarly interests. So you should always be careful about Wikipedia. In my view, it's not a scholarly source. I do not let my students use it. I can't stop them if they go and read it behind my back, but it shouldn't be showing up in essays or by either being cited or quoted. Of course, I use Wikipedia in many ways. If I'm going and visiting a city, I'll look something up on Wikipedia, and the information is pretty well always reliable about getting around town and sights to see and restaurants and things like that. No problems there. Or if I'm trying to think of who played a certain character in a movie of 10 years ago, Wikipedia is great for that kind of stuff. But again, I don't use Wikipedia in my teaching or my professional writing or research. So, that concludes what I wanted to say a little bit about sources. I hope it was helpful. Thank you.